I've always, personally, I don't, maybe you all may feel this way as well. I've always felt like the bishop's address is kind of disjointed from the convention. We go through this process of getting everything organized and making appointments and doing all this stuff. And then for those of you who do any public speaking or whatever, and maybe Bishop Wright can relate to this, shifting from being in administrative mode in 10 to 15 seconds and going into a mode when you're trying to present something always has its challenges. So I hope you'll bear with me. But I also just want to comment also, I think most of you, if you're not aware, maybe see me walking around this thing, I had a hip replacement just a couple weeks ago. Things are going well, and I'm moving forward in that recovery, but I wasn't a very good patient. About a week after my surgery, I was feeling really good, and went for my post-op visit with my doctor, and he said, "You have no restrictions, but listen to your body and let it be your guide in how much you take on in your activity." And after I heard no restriction, I immediately was making a tee time to play golf, and I kind of came back just a little bit too soon back into the office at 100%, and unfortunately inflamed the bone and the prosthesis that's been put into my leg, and so that kind of forced me into immobilizing myself for a while, and Debbie would just assume that I go immobilize myself somewhere else now because I'm not the most patient. But having said that, they gave me some really interesting medication. And I can tell you that some of that stuff really works well. So I have spent some of my time in a rather euphoric state. But so my presentation this morning may be a little bit disjointed. I apologize for that if it is. If it's good, then I will accept credit for that. If it's bad, I'm blaming it on the drugs. But anyways, going forward with that. So please, I hope that you'll bear with me. I do want to, once again, I stand before you now, beginning my 10th year as your bishop. It seems like it was seriously just yesterday that I stood before you the very first time in 2007. It has been an incredible journey and one awesome ride. And I cannot even begin to think of where I would rather be or who I would rather be serving in God's kingdom with than all of you here in Oklahoma. You are an incredible group of people whose faith and depth of spirituality wows me on a daily basis, and I'm honored to be here as your bishop. I want to thank all of those who, over the last couple of weeks, the phone calls, the cards, the humorous things that you've emailed me, and just the support and the prayers as I go through this time of recovery and transition. The words of encouragement have meant a great deal and have sustained me in those difficult days when the things were not going always as I hoped that they would. Before I get into my address, I once again want to welcome and thank Bishop Wright for being here. I think I can tell you I believe that Rob is a prophetic voice in our church and in the world. He is a man of great character and has been a voice for children and the less fortunate and the disenfranchised in our world and society. You heard him allude to the fact that he jumped out of a helicopter. He's a veteran, 5 years in the Navy, and literally talks about jumping out of helicopters not only in the middle of the ocean to do those things that need to be done there, but in the deepest, darkest, most horrific places in our world in serving our country and in allowing us to have the freedoms that we have to be here. I am honored that he is here with us today, and I'm proud not only to call him a colleague and a fellow bishop, but a brother who I have a great deal of love and affection and respect for. So, Rob, thank you for being here. And again, I want to thank all of those who offered themselves locally here in our diocese and from beyond during my search for a new canon of the ordinary. I had about 35 applicants from across our diocese, across Tech. I even had a couple of folks internationally that I asked them. I said, now you know this is Oklahoma, right? It's not London. It's not Paris. It is Oklahoma. But we and especially in this diocese, we are gifted with some incredible people, and it was it took me a lot of time to work through that process and to discern where we were going. But I think that that Bill is going to lead us in great ways, and I am thankful that he has accepted this position, and I look forward to moving forward with him as we begin to restructure some things and continue the good work of this diocese. So, Bill, once again, thank you for your willingness to serve with me in this place, and I look forward to our years ahead as we go through this. Thank you. And again, to the good people of Emmanuel Church, I owe you big time. I will say that openly, and I know that you will come collecting, and I am ready for that. So, I want to this morning. I want to do a couple things. I want to fulfill my canonical responsibilities of giving you sort of the state of the diocese as is required, and then I want to reflect just a little bit on the past 9.5 years or 9+ years as we enter into this 10th year of my episcopacy and our shared ministry in this place together. And then I want to, if my emotions hold up, share just some personal reflections on our convention theme and some recent experiences that I've had that might hopefully give at least some insight as to where we're at and where we're headed, and I think the challenges before us. I told Rob last evening when he was here, we visited for a little while, I said, I'm going to let you do the heavy lifting on this over the next day or so, but I do want to offer a couple of things. The state of the diocese. We are in excellent shape. As you heard from Henry, we are financially sound and viable. We are blessed with gifts from people who have gone before us that has sustained us and allowed us to be able to do a lot of things that many dioceses are not able to do. We as a diocese budget right at $1 million a year just to support the congregations and ministries in various places here, and that's an important part of who we are because we are diverse. We have a couple of populous areas in our state, but the majority of our state's pretty rural, and our expectations for smaller congregations in those rural areas of growing to a position or a place where they can be self-sustaining is probably not realistic. But we also are very aware that the people who live in those places and who minister in those places are doing incredible work to reach out to the world around them and to bring the face of Christ and the words of Christ and the love of Christ to others. That's one of the things that I've said from early on when I arrived here and when I started first making visitations. A lot of our smaller churches, it was kind of like, okay, Bishop, when are you going to shut us down? It's not my intention to close churches. That's not what we're about. We will do everything we can as long as we are being faithful to the gospel, as long as we are growing spiritually, and more importantly, as long as we are looking outward from ourselves into the world and proclaiming the good news of Christ. Then we will find a way as a diocese to continue supporting those various congregations. We are a growing diocese. In the last 6 years, we have grown about 5% cumulatively. In the last report at General Convention, I believe there were only 4 or 5 dioceses in tech that showed growth in the church, and a couple of those were dioceses in what we refer to as Province 9. Those are our dioceses in Central, South America, or Latin America, and so forth. But that's something to be said. That in the midst of the challenges and the struggles that are being faced in places, we are still reaching people, and we're not stealing sheep from folks. We're not doing. There are plenty of folks who are lost and hurt and wandering out there that are seeking and looking for something to give purpose and meaning to their lives, and we're doing a good job of reaching out to them. Can we do better? We could, absolutely, and that's one of the things that we are doing is with our intentional work around church growth and development, and looking for different ways to open up those doors for people to come and experience Jesus Christ, and we're doing a good job about that. I think we continue to grow spiritually in our diocese. As I travel throughout the diocese and make visitations, I'm amazed and aware of the many opportunities that you are creating in your own congregations to gather together as community and small groups and other things to continue to not only address your own personal relationship with Christ, with one another, your spiritual journeys, but also creating doors and opportunities for others to come in and to know those things as well. And I think that's the real basis of church growth. It's not about numbers and peoples and the people in the pews. If we do anything that all we're doing is looking at trying to put more numbers on the board, we're doing the wrong thing. I think the growth that we have seen in our church is directly related to the spiritual growth and the faithfulness that you all have shown in the life and the ministry of your congregations, and that you are truly about the gospel. You are about proclaiming the good news of Christ. You are about being the hands and the feet and the love of Jesus in the world. That resonates with people. That gives people hope. That brings people in. They come and they search and they find a place with whatever it is they're dealing with in their life, wherever they're at, whatever it is that's challenging them. They come and they find a place where they can feel safe and they can figure things out and they can be supported and nourished. And that's how you grow churches, is to be relevant in people's lives. And I commend you for that work that we're doing. The Diocese of Oklahoma has certainly elevated, I would say, its presence on the larger stage, if you want to call it that. We have been blessed recently here the last few weeks with the presence of our presiding bishop, who was here for our annual Ochre Hater honor dance and celebration, and then the following day he made a visitation at St. Augustine's Church on Sunday morning, and thank you, Joseph, for not having the elephants and the camels in the room on that day. But, I will tell you that in remarks at the House of Bishops the following week, that the presiding bishop made comment about his visit to Oklahoma and how much he enjoyed being here and being part of the honor dance and participating at the worship at St. Augustine's. Sharon Jones, who's the presiding bishop's executive assistant, following the service that Sunday morning, came back into the sacristy with Joseph and I, and with tears in her eyes, and said, "I have been the executive assistant for the presiding bishop for the presiding bishop's office for more than 10 years, and I've traveled all over the world with them." And she said, "I have to tell you that was one of the most inspirational and uplifting worship services that I have ever been a party to." And she has shared that openly with others. And again, I think that goes to the nature of who we are. We will be blessed again with the presence of our presiding, and I got a lot of comments from a lot of bishops in the House of Bishops wanting to know how I was getting the PB in my diocese 3 times in 1 year. Well, having been the chair of the nominating committee, And then on the PB's transition committee, I had a little bit of access to his calendar, and I kind of penciled things in ahead of time for others. But we, Michael Curry will be here next year as the Diocese of Oklahoma hosts Episcopal Youth Event, which is the triennial gathering of the youth from across the Episcopal Church. And so he will be here as part of that, and we will hear later in this convention a report from one of our youth about that gathering and the meaning of it. And again, the Diocese of Oklahoma hosting a national event like that is another sign of the health and vitality of this place. And then, notwithstanding the presence of our guests this year, the presiding bishop will be our guest preacher next year at our 80th Diocesan Convention. So things are good in life here. So as I look back over the last 10 years, I've been trying to. One of the things that happened with Canon Jose's departure, and I want you to know that Jose sent his greetings to us last evening. His sadness for not being here. He said that this is, he feels like he needs to be here. But he sends his greetings and his love to all of you, and his thanks to you for the support that you gave him in the way that you nurtured him as a new canon of the ordinary here 9.5 years ago, and worked with him. And I've heard him say on more than one occasion to the people in the Diocese of Western North Carolina that it was this diocese, that it was you who brought him to the place to where he could be a bishop in the church today. It was through your nurturing and your working with him and supporting him that allowed him to grow into that place to be there. So he sends his love to all of you, and then he said, and next week I have to fly solo by myself because it's my first diocesan convention. So he says, so how do you get through that? What do you do? But he is doing great, and I just ask that you continue to keep Jose and Laurel and Allison and Alex in your thoughts and prayers. Alex is actually still here in Oklahoma. He's attending OSU, and so they'll be back and forth a little bit. But please continue to keep them in your prayers. But what I was going to say was that having that departure and Jose moving on really opened up an opportunity for me to kind of get back into things at a deeper level. You can imagine that, Jose did a great job, and my staff does an incredible job of handling things on a day-to-day basis. And oftentimes, I'm kind of get caught up here at that 50,000-foot view, and I see things, but I'm not really in the weeds. But it was an opportunity for me to kind of re-engage things in a deeper way, which was not only reinvigorating and energizing, but open up my eyes to some things that I think we can be doing maybe a little bit different, and we'll be working on that as we go forward after the first year, and putting some new structures in place around some things that I think became too office-centric and really needs to be drawing upon the skills, the talents, and the passion of people in our diocese and so forth. So I hope that as we begin that process after the first of the year, that if called upon or if you are moved, that you will step up and join with the various kinds of teams that we want to hope to put together as we continue to be about the work that's been given to us. But it also gave me an opportunity to kind of reflect upon the last 9.5 years and some of the things that we've done, because it's been incredible. I think all of us we have become very intentional about our church growth and development. And again, I go back to saying that it's not just about numbers, but we've become very intentional about making our ministries and the presence of Christ relevant in people's everyday lives. And we as a diocese, at least I've tried to bring alongside us resources that we can use to help us in that process. We're working with the Natural Church Development process that Tony Moon is heading up and working with many of you on, and I'd say that some of you are doing really great and you're into that thing and you're pumping it away and good stuff's happening, and some of you have kind of done a little bit and some of you have put the binder on the shelf and it's away in the corner, but I'd encourage you to kind of take a look at those things. We've engaged Renewal Works. Everett Lee's brought that to us, and other congregations are doing that to talk about the individual and congregational spirituality of things and so forth. We've been intentional about looking at places where we could take congregations that may have had some difficulties or been through some challenges and transitions and do some church restarts. Christ Church in Tulsa, where Everett Lee's is serving, we're about 5 or 6 years into that now, and they just keep pumping along and doing great things along there. The restart that we've done with Grace Church in Yukon with Tim and Kirsten Bear is just taking off and doing great stuff, and I think one of the things that we did as a council a couple years ago was we recognized the need for us to be thinking in a futuristic way, and seeing what was happening in Yukon and looking at the demographics and things. We knew that we were going to be at a place pretty quickly where that was a church that could not contain itself. In a lot of ways, that's kind of a neat way to think about that. They just can't contain themselves. But we purchased a plot of land a few miles down the road from them a couple of years ago, anticipating this would happen, and we are now beginning the work with that congregation to move towards, hopefully in the next couple of years, breaking ground and building a facility that will accommodate the incredible ministry that's going to take place in that place. And the council has made a conscious decision to do what we call land banking. So we are in the process of trying to develop places throughout the state where we can buy land now in preparation for planting new churches. I mean, I want you to think about this. When I arrived here 9.5 years ago, as I mentioned earlier, the conversation from a lot of churches was, when are you going to close us? The conversation today in this diocese is, where are we going to plant the next church? And that's exciting. We've kind of stepped back from actually purchasing land just a little bit. You've heard from the treasurer that the proceeds that allow us to do that is our royalties from oil and gas. That's tapered off just a little bit, and while we probably could do those things, we want to be cautious in making those decisions and not extend ourselves too far, but we're hoping to get back to that place. But we are looking forward to that. So I mean, we've in the last few years, we've gone from this place of kind of just existing to looking in the future about how we are going to bring more people into relationship with Christ. Our Holy Orders process has been incredible. You may remember after I arrived that we suspended the process for about 18 months, 2 years, and reevaluated some things, and we wanted to make sure that we not only were raising up folks that we can go to seminary, but we wanted to find ways to train people on a local level and to raise up good leadership in our diocese. And as I mentioned, we have ordained nearly 50 persons in this diocese in the last 9 years. I've talked to bishops in some dioceses that have not ordained clergy for several years and don't have anybody in the pipeline. To imagine that we have not only ordained 50, but we have 30 people in the process in some form or another, whether that's in the first year of the aspirancy process or preparing to graduate from seminary and to be ordained. Imagine that. Little old Oklahoma. 30 folks in our School of Iona, under the leadership of our Dean, Steve Orwig, has been incredible. We've had a couple of classes now. Our bivocational clergy are doing great work in congregations that cannot afford to have a full-time clergy person, but that there's incredible potential there. Again, just something else that we've brought alongside to be able to advance the work that we're given to do here. St. Crispin's. I wish I could stand up here and say to you that the project's almost done. It's almost done. Almost is, we can all interpret that. What I will say to you, I mean, we have certainly had some challenges. Anytime you have a construction project of this size in a rural part of the state, or any place that's rural, there's always those difficulties of getting subcontractors out there on a consistent basis. But I will tell you that the work that's being done is quality work, and we are holding to making sure that we don't cut corners, that we are doing something that's going to sustain us and advance the program of St. Crispin's, and when we get the new dining hall, the cabins, the pavilion, and everything completed, it is going to change our programming opportunities out there in the way that we can continue to reach out, not just to the young in our diocese and throughout the state, but to all of us, young and old alike, and give us some great opportunities. So we're hopeful, and we anticipate that we will be in those cabins and be working forward with this year's summer camp program. And the dining hall is looking great. We certainly run into a couple of small little infrastructure types issues, the things that nobody really like to talk about, but you got to have pipes that make stuff go away. And we've been working on those things as well. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be hearing a report later, I think tomorrow morning. One of the things I asked last year was to put together a small committee to look at restructuring and improving this gathering, our diocesan convention. And you'll be hearing a report from the chair of that committee, Tony Moon, about ways that we want to take this and not just make it about a bunch of business. We would really like to find a way where we could do the business, the work that we have to do with the diocese, but we want to open this gathering up to the larger diocese, to where we can actually use it as an opportunity to gather together, not only in fellowship, but to create programming, to bring new resources alongside, for people to attend conferences or seminars or forums that give them tools that they can take back to their local communities and things to advance the work that we have to do and so forth. So you'll hear more about that later in this convention. You'll also hear a report about how our continuing efforts to improve our diocesan communication. Nicole Baxley, our communications director, you may remember we had a survey that a lot of you participated. We had a great response to that, and I thank you for responding to that survey. But I'm going to steal some of Nicole's thunder here, and she's going to get mad at me for doing that. But for those of you out there who are techies and like this, in January of next year, the Diocese of Oklahoma is going to have their own app. So when she told me that, I said, "What are we applying for?" But we've been working with an organization for over a year now and trying to put something together, and Nicole's been leading the charge on that and just doing a great job. And she'll be able to show you some of that graphically, what it's going to look like. But it is going to, it'll for those of us who are not real techie oriented and that stuff, but it may be a little bit of a challenge. But for most everybody else, it'll be a way for us to communicate in real time with a lot of things and really, I think, enhance what's going on in our diocese and so forth. So, but I think over the last 10 years, we have just moved in so many positive directions. Have we had little hiccups along the way? Yeah. Have we stubbed our toes? Yeah. But that didn't deter us, and you all are doing incredible work. And again, I want to thank all of you here, and please take it back to your communities of faith. That I'm. It's a joy for me to talk about you, whether it's at the House of Bishops or in other places, because we truly are about the work of Jesus Christ in this place, and we're transforming lives and we're making a difference for other people. So please keep up that work. I want to shift a little bit now and talk a little bit about our theme. As you heard Bishop Wright say, we are probably in one of the most divisive times in our country. We are on the eve of electing a national leader and find ourselves in a place where the majority of all Americans are completely unsatisfied with either of our candidates. And this is not a political statement, and it's not about who's better, who's worse, or anything, but we can do better. And we have to do better. And I think that it's up to people of faith to lead the way for that. Our presiding bishop offers a salutation on most times now as he's moving forward with what he refers to as the Jesus movement. a loving, liberating, and life-giving God. And if you've not heard those words or that salutation before, you're going to hear more of it. You're going to hear more of it from me, and you're going to hear more of it from our presiding bishop. If you're not paying attention, I would encourage you to do that, because he's all over the internet, and everything he does is being published, and there are videos there, but listen to what he has to say. But we recognize that we are living at a time in our history where we are dividing ourselves in unhealthy ways, where we are making judgments about people based on arbitrary monikers, whatever that may be, whether it's the color of their skin or their sexual orientation, whether they have tattoos or piercings, or whether they have a particular station in life, their wealth, or other kinds of things. And it is destroying us. It is taking us to a place to where people don't think that it's wrong anymore to lash out with demeaning and derogatory language of the names that we call one another. We find ourselves in a place in society where people feel it's okay, or that it's within their rights, or whatever, however you want to say it, that they can act out violently against others. We just had a couple of nights ago, again, 2 police officers sitting in their police units doing their work, writing a report, and someone walks up and shoots and kills them, attacks them for no purpose. On the other side of the coin, we hear stories every single day, and this is one that kind of hits it home for me, having been a law enforcement officer, where we actually see video evidence of police officers acting out in inappropriate ways and overstepping their bounds in their use of authority in ways that are inappropriate. But we're at a point in time where I don't want to accept what the pundits and commentators on TV is saying, is that this is the new norm, that this is the way that we're going to have to live our lives going forward, that we're going to have to just get used to the fact that people are going to be mean and people are going to act out violently, and it's okay to call people names, and it's okay to say you're good and you're bad and you're in and you're out, and that nobody's deserving unless I decide that you're deserving in our own judgmental ways. But as Bishop Wright said to us, if we're going to do anything to change the rhetoric, if we're going to change anything to change the trajectory of where we're headed in this country or in our own communities and our own environments, it has to start with us. It has to start with each one of us individually. This past year, I had 2 opportunities to travel to Ghana in Africa. My first trip back in January was with Episcopal Relief and Development. I was invited by Rob Radke, the president of ERD, to go and visit and see the work that ERD is trying to do throughout the world, and raising people up and helping them create lives of sustainability and of independence, where they can achieve all that they're intended to be. And we visited some incredible places in Ghana, and sometimes I think we get kind of locked in our ideas that we have to have some dramatic program. We have to put millions of dollars into something and come up with some massive thing that's going to change the world. And we lose sight of is that what we really need to change starts with just individuals one at a time. And some of the things that we went to see were up in the northern part of Ghana, where we are working with various groups of folks in villages. In one particular village there we visited, there were probably 50 women sitting underneath an outdoor kind of pavilion, and they were all weaving baskets. When we arrived, they all got up, and the incredible hospitality of the African people is incredible. It's just awesome. But they all got up, and as we were coming into their village, they welcomed us with song and dance, literally dancing around us, welcoming us to come and to be with them and to see. And then we sat and we talked to them, and what ERD was doing was they were doing what they call microfinancing kind of stuff. The women, in order to do something where they can purchase food or barter for food or other things, they needed a product, and they were making baskets, but they didn't have the money to buy the supplies to create the baskets. And so what ERD did is they went in with each one of these women, and they gave them a $1,000 loan over a 3-year period so that they could purchase what they needed in order to make these baskets that they could then take to the market and either barter or they could be shipped and sold and so forth. It sounds like a small thing, and but it gave these women independence. It gave them pride and self-worth that they were creating something that helped them provide for their families. And as we talked to these women, you could just see the passion in their faces about how that had transformed their lives in that one small gesture. And we were kind of talking to Rob, and then we were asking, well, do the women pay the money back? And he said, most of the time. So some of the women have a little difficulty. I said, well, what do you do if someone doesn't pay back? He said, well, we don't do anything. He said, but the other women of the village hold them accountable. Talk about pressure, huh? It's not about the lender coming in and saying, okay, you're past due, we're going to charge you more interest or whatever. But the women of that village hold them accountable to respect the gift that's been given to them and to live into the promises that they made. And 100% of the time, it may have taken a little bit longer, 100% of the time, every single woman paid back that $1,000. Now, that's not about ERD getting their money back. It's about ERD getting that money back so that money can be used to help someone in another village in a different way. In another village, they went and they provided the women a donkey and a cart. Interesting. But it allowed the women to be able to cultivate their fields. First of all, we're talking about this part of Africa is it is the most rural of rural. About the only way I can describe it, if you can imagine the pictures in National Geographic that we used to look at of rural Africa, there's no electricity. There's no running water. There are wells in the ground. Firewood is their fuel. I mean, they collect wood, and the wood is taken to somebody else who turns it into charcoal. I didn't know you took wood and burned it to make it charcoal. I didn't know you burnt something in order to burn it, but it was really cool. But these people, they have literally nothing. They live in mud and grass huts with thatch roofs, and they build these compounds. But the women were not able to cultivate the fields because they're not strong enough to handle the oxen that are used to trawl the ground. And so by giving them a donkey, they were able to trawl the ground to plant their seeds. And then they had the cart so that they could come along when the season was over and they could harvest their product, and they could take the cart and they could take it to the market to barter it. And then in the off season when they weren't growing, they used that cart and the donkey to go out into the rural area to collect firewood that could be used as their fuel and sold to the guy who turns it into charcoal. We took a simple thing that many of us would say, well, we could think of other things and maybe how to fix it, but we took a simple thing, listened to what they needed, and gave them something that made them productive, that allowed them to sustain their lives and transform their lives. One of the women in our group were asking the women, they said, well, what has this done for you as a person? And they talked about the dignity that they felt as being productive. They talked about the fact that they could barter and get clothes for their children to wear to go to school, or that they could even send their children to schools. Most of the schools there are private, and there's some level of tuition. Or the fact that the kids could actually wear shoes. And then one of the women said, well, do you ever take anything, for yourselves? What do you do? And one of the women, you could see it in her face, the tears. And she said, this has let me be a woman again. And she went on to say, she said, I've been able to buy a dress, and I've been able to purchase makeup, and I get to be a wife to my husband. Imagine that. In that small gesture from ERD, that woman found dignity and self-worth and was able to give herself in a loving way to her husband. Guys, we probably don't get that. Ladies, I think you figure out what I'm saying. To be able to be a woman to your family, to your spouse. Incredible. A simple gesture. And the way that the women paid this back was the women mated their donkeys. And the first one went back to ERD. And then the rest of them they get to sell. I can go on, I can tell you, that they've done the same kind of thing with giving them goats where they can make cheese and get goat milk, or they gave them a grinder so they could take rice and turn it into flour. But what I'm saying is that it was an opportunity to see people's lives transformed in the simplest of ways, because we weren't locked up in judging them or discerning their worth or who they were or where they came from or what they had or anything else. It was purely about being in relationship and our ultimate concern of being, how can we make life better for each other? As part of that visit, we went to the places that were used as the routes for the slave trades. And they took us to a place in the middle of nowhere. It was a location, as it was explained to us and described to us, as it was a gathering point where those who had been stolen, tricked, bought, by whatever means they found to be brought into this trade, as a gathering point in the heart of Ghana. And they chose this place because of the large trees and the rock formations. And they were able to gather hundreds at a time, thousands at a time, of those who were being forced into this slave trade. And it worked because they could chain them up to the trees. They could chain them up to the rocks, and so they could control them. And one of the things that they would do is that if you didn't have those who were engaged in the trade, if you didn't have something to receive your daily allotment of what I would say is porridge, that's the best way I could describe it, then you didn't get to eat, because then all they did is they just threw it on the ground in front of you. And so the slaves would take rocks, and they'd been chained to these huge kind of dome rocks. They would take rocks and they would grind into the rock, make a bowl, literally in the rock. And so when the traders came along to feed them, the porridge would at least get thrown into that hewn out bowl in that rock, so that they could at least be able to eat something. And then there was a little spring there in the middle of the rock where they would get their water, but in order to get their water, you had to one had to pass it to the other, so they had to create cups. So they got rocks and they hewn into the rocks and made cups out of rocks to be able to get water out of the hole in the ground and pass it to the others that were around there. And they would be kept in this place anytime for a couple of weeks, maybe a month on end, until there was enough, and then they would be force marched down the coast to what we refer to as castles, these forts that had been built along the coast where they were They were sold and traded and then marched out onto the beach and put into boats and brought to the West. But in the middle of this place where they kept them, and the same thing at the castles, they had a thing called Discipline Rock. This was a rock that had been hewn in such a way that they could lay the human body over it, stomach face down, and that the ankles and the hands could be chained underneath it so that they couldn't move or get up. And any time you acted out or you disobeyed or you didn't do what you were told, you were chained to this rock, and you were, depending on what it was, you were either left there to bake into the sun, or you were whipped, or you were beaten, but most times you were stripped naked in front of everyone and made an example of. It's their way of controlling others by putting fear into them. And for those who didn't survive Discipline Rock, they literally would have the other slaves dig a hole right next to it and push their bodies into it. And all over this particular area are all these graves of thousands of slaves who were tortured and who were murdered and were buried. As I stood there and I listened to the stories being told to us, the reality of what happened in that particular time, the first thing that came to my mind was that when I was a student, when I was growing up, when I was in school, I was lied to. We were all lied to. Because all of the rhetoric that said that we were bringing people to this country for a better life and that we were doing it for them and all of the other stuff you want to put out there was total garbage. And as Bishop Rob has said, nobody's clean in this. It took all of us to literally decide by whatever means we did to choose some particular person out of the world and society and say, you are the lowest of lowest, you are below even the dirtiest animal on the face of the earth. And we're going to treat you that way. And I imagined someone being laid across that rock and their captors with their whip in front of all the others to see, snapping it across their backs, calling them names, telling them that they were worthless, breaking them. And if they didn't survive, no big deal, just toss them in a hole and cover them up. And we got to the castles along the shore, and we would go in there, and they took us into what they referred to as the dungeons. This was the holding cells, if you want to call it that, for the slaves as they were brought and being prepared to be sold. And these dungeons had maybe one small little window up in a corner. There was no ventilation. They're underground. There's no sunlight coming in. They're dark. And they would pack hundreds of them into small spaces that were maybe 25, 30 feet wide by maybe 60 or 70 feet long. And they were forced to live there and to stay there for weeks and months on end, living in their own human waste and vomit and bodily fluids and everything else you could think of, because they were not allowed out for any purpose. And once a day, the slave traders would come in and they would throw some food into this room where all of this excrement was all over the ground, and the slaves would be forced to be eaten from that. And to this day, if you go back, all of that human waste is caked feet deep on the grounds of these dungeons in which these people were forced to live. And they kept them in there until they were broken and they were weak and they couldn't rebel, and that they would weed out the weakest because they would die and the strong, they would get them to a point to where they could control them so that they could transport them across the Atlantic. And once again, right in the middle of these castles was another discipline rock that they used to discipline those who wouldn't go along with the program. There were dungeons for the men and there were dungeons for the women. And the commandant of this particular castles, these castles were built 4 or 5 stories high, and naturally at the top would be the quarters for the captain or whoever was in charge of this thing. And on a whim, whenever he felt like it, he would come out to his balcony and look down into the courtyard, and he would order that all of the women slaves be brought out, and they'd line them up. And then he would take his pick. And they would go and clean them up and bring them to him for him to have his way with them however he wanted. And if they resisted, if they refused, they were taken to the discipline rock and disciplined and then thrown into another dungeon, into a hot box, as they called it. And when he got done with them, they then became available for any of the other soldiers or officers at the camp. In the middle of these castles, in the middle of their courtyard, there was a building. It was their chapel, built directly above the dungeons. And they would gather there on a daily and a weekly basis. They would pray. They'd give thanks to God. They'd say the Lord's Prayer. They would baptize, recite the covenant. You need to remember something. The majority of these people were English, Brits, Church of England, Anglican Communion, Episcopal Church. And with people living in their own human waste, not 20 feet below them, they would recite the baptismal covenant of continuing in the fellowship of the apostles, of loving their neighbor as themselves, as respecting the dignity of every human being, without even flinching an eye or giving the least amount of thought to those just below their feet. That was a profound moment for me. That was a day when my reality collided with the reality of the world. When it brought back the memories that I had in 1965 when I stood on a patio deck in my backyard and I watched the riots in Los Angeles as buildings were being burnt and people were acting out in violent ways and being oppressed. It reminded me of the first black students who came to school in an all-white school where I attended, and administrators from the school had to walk with them through the halls. It reminded me of the first black police officer who came on our police department, and the number of white officers who demanded that their lockers be moved away from them because they were not going to dress next to somebody like that. It was a day where I became very aware that I was a racist, that I was contributing to all of those things that were happening, whether it was overtly or intentionally, or just by the mere fact that I let it happen, that I didn't stand up and I didn't say something, that I didn't act in a different way. We cannot begin to do the work of reconciliation in this world until we accept and acknowledge our culpability in what's happened. The things that we do or don't do, the things that we have said, the way that we look at one another, the judgments that we make without any information whatsoever about who's in and who's out and who's good and who's bad. Until we stand up and accept that we are all part of this problem, we can never get to the point of talking about how we can begin to know the love of Christ in this world. And it's time that we have to do that. We can't wait anymore. We can't stand by and say, oh, it'll be okay. We can't let our political leaders stand up and bash one another and call people names and say derogatory things about one another. We can't let injustice continue in the world. It can't be okay for us to walk across the street or walk around somebody who's laying incapacitated on the road because somehow they find themselves in a difficult place. We can no longer begin to be giving privilege to those who have been privileged on the backs of those who have been disenfranchised. And the only way that can happen is for each of us, you and me, individually, to acknowledge who we are, the sinners that we are, seek repentance, and then ask for God's guidance and wisdom that His Spirit might guide us in a new way of living and being together with one another. Hopefully now I'm a recovering racist. But I am committed to working with others and to being part of this thing our presiding bishop calls the Jesus movement, to make a difference in the world. I am not willing any longer to let my brothers and sisters in Christ, to let my brothers and sisters who may worship a different deity, to let my brothers and sisters who may not worship any deity be treated in those ways any longer. And I pray that the work that we do in this place, in this church, and in this diocese will be to bring about a new way of living together, and that we might begin to get a glimpse of the kingdom of God that's been intended for each of us. I hope that you will join me in this. I hope that you will hold me accountable to this. And I pray that the love of Christ will prevail. And that at least in this place, people will know that Jesus Christ is our way. He's our leader and our guide. And we will stand up as His disciples. Amen.